Last but not least, we are fortunate to have Christopher Forth with us today as our commentator. Chris received his PhD from SUNY Buffalo, now the University of Buffalo, in 1994, and he is currently Dean's Professor of Humanities and Professor of History at the University of Kansas. He is the author of Zarathustra in Paris, the Nietzsche Vogue in France, 1891 to 1918, The Dreyfus Affair and the Crisis of French Manhood, which I still love teaching, and Masculinity in the Modern West, Gender, Civilization, and the Body, which was published in 2008. He has co-edited 8 volumes, including Confronting Modernity in Fin de Siècle France with our honoree, and numerous articles and essays. He is currently working on 2 monographs about bodily substances, and you can ask him about that later. Without further ado, Christopher Forth.
It's not so bad, really. Thank you, Cheryl. Elinor was not my mentor, but I wish that she had been now. I was really honored to have been asked by Cheryl to comment on the panel celebrating Elinor's many contributions to the field. We all know of her accomplishments as an author of numerous field-defining works, but also as a conscientious mentor and generous colleague. Although I'm not a specialist at all in women's history, I can say that gender and the politics of social reform in Third Republic France was crucial for the development of my understanding of the history of women and gender in France. As a young PhD, I kind of remade myself as a gender historian, so that your work was absolutely essential for that. Although our paths crossed at a number of conferences, my more direct experiences with Elinor have been as a colleague when we co-edited what amounted to a secret festschrift for Robert Nye, published as Confronting Modernity in Fin de Siècle France. It was there that I saw more of what lots of other people had told me about Elinor, a rigorous and conscientious scholar, of course, but also a careful and generous colleague and a warm and supportive person. I'd like to thank you, Elinor, for all that you've done for us at the field, at the level of as a scholar, as a mentor, as a colleague, as a friend. Thank you so much. So after jumping at the opportunity to comment on this panel, it was only later that I realized that I'm really not a specialist on any of this stuff anymore, which puts me into a kind of uncomfortable position. And I'm not even sure these days really how much of a French historian I can really pass as. So with these qualifications ahead of time, that's just sort of my way of telling you this may not be great, but I will certainly do my best. So acknowledging my lack of expertise in the areas covered by these papers, my comments will mainly be of the observation-making and question-posing sort. I hope the panelists will find something of use in all of this. The panel is focused on women's agency and activism, topics that have been central to Elinor's scholarship, and which all 3 of the papers address to one degree or another. Having lately become someone involved in the history of emotion, though, I noticed that the themes of love and attachment circulate throughout these papers, overtly in the case of Andrea's and Carolyn's essays, and somewhat more subtly in the case of Trish's. Although none of the papers are explicitly connected to the history of emotions per se, perhaps thinking along these lines could yield some useful ideas. One of the things I liked about all these papers is that they're so rich. You can already see the directions in which they could go, so I feel slightly embarrassed about posing some of the questions that I am, because I suspect that the authors may have already been thinking about these things, so I'm sorry if that's really what happens. So love is obviously front and center in Andrea's fascinating paper on matchmaking in early 19th century Paris, though love here is enmeshed in other things, not least of which is the making of a good match. There seems to be a tension, I notice, between love as a supposedly spontaneously arising emotion and agency, which Andrea calls the rational calculations these women made as autonomous consumers. As the paper demonstrates quite nicely, what is called love is literally mediated by the services of a matchmaker, employing modern techniques to bring hearts together, but is also reliant upon other and perhaps mutually exclusive factors, the financial worth of the potential partners, but also the correspondence to literary tropes. The role played by the latter interests me here, given that some of Villaume's correspondents seem to have been very aware of the public personae they were creating. I was particularly struck by Villaume's orchestration of chance encounters at offices and theaters, where lonely hearts could size each other up without the other's knowledge. Literary conventions recommended other places, such as masked balls, where the play of identity and concealment may have contributed to an intensification of affect. Reminded of how historical and geographical work on emotion challenges the interiority of affects by drawing attention to material culture as well as the built environment, I was wondering if certain places were selected for reasons beyond their sheer functionality. Villaume's own, perhaps apocryphal, story of how he met his future wife on the Rue du Hasard could have been lifted from a novel, where the very place name seems to play a role in the elicitation of feeling. Rather than functioning as a neutral and blank modern space facilitating anonymous meetings, were specific Parisian locations believed to be especially conducive for eliciting emotions like this, like love. Attention to place might allow us to widen the scope of agency, to consider not only women as actors, but Paris itself as a material condition for and enabler of emotional experience. Doing so might leave less room for autonomy, but it might result in a more complicated analysis. While the literary references seem obvious in letters where correspondents seek the experience of love at first sight, in scenarios that seem to be clearly pulled from popular plays, situations also in which rational choice seems less operative, a distinction is made between these women and those who assert their autonomy. By publicly asserting their strong, passionate, and independent characters, the latter category of women in Andrea's paper do seem to have been rejecting both the old regime despotism and Napoleonic patriarchy. In so doing, they did send out clear messages to the kind of men who might be up for a revolutionary companionate union. But willful women who resist patriarchy are not uncommon characters in literature, even if their function is to provide an obstacle to be overcome as they are restored to their proper role at the end of the narrative. This is why I wonder, and I admit with very scant knowledge of literary culture of this period, whether assertions of autonomy were entirely free of inflection by literary tropes. Being somewhat suspicious of assertions of rational and autonomous agency, as you might imagine, I think there's a conversation to be had about where the feeling called love comes from that includes activity and agency while accounting for many other factors as well. Love is also central to Carolyn's very rich and engaging paper, which discusses the thoughts of Olympe Audouard, Hubertine Auclair, and Paul Manck on how literal polygamy in certain Arab cultures resembled the figurative polygamy practiced by unfaithful husbands in the metropole. But whereas in Andrea's paper we have a sense of what kind of love her female correspondents had in mind, here the matter is less clear beyond a union based on marital fidelity. What seems to come across as real love, rather like traditional concepts of beauty, seems to refer to something higher than mere lust or sensuality that, in the writings of these women, seems to either reduce humans to the state of animals or, in extreme cases, forces men to seek out animal or male partners. I wonder then about the role of sex and the body in the marriages being celebrated by these women. Moreover, as a sometime historian of masculinities, I'd be interested to know more about Audouard's contention that Turkish men lost their vital masculine powers in the harem. If I am right to assume that what caused these men to lose all of their energy and often their intelligence, rendering them brutalized, was in fact excessive coitus and semen loss, then how did this I'm assuming. Then how did this relate to the vitality of metropolitan Frenchmen who frequented mistresses and brothels or who simply masturbated? For all their political differences, then, do all three women subscribe to some form of a bourgeois ideal of marriage as an exalted and thus somewhat disembodied state? Based as it is on law, the Frenchness, or the supposed Frenchness of this higher love is, according to Manck, something unavailable to Arab women. Auclair disagrees, maintaining the universality of an emotion shared by French and Arab women alike, even if Muslim law prevents the latter from feeling it for very long. What is interesting to me here is how one exalted form of love, which is not very well defined, seems to give rise to another. For Auclair, a reform of love in the Arab family, which could only be accomplished by direct French intervention in local religious laws, would generate another kind of love, the passionate kind that 3 million assimilated Algerian children might someday feel for France. Is love, then, to be understood as a prerequisite for the formation of the nation, as an affective as well as imagined community? Or is the love referred to here of a more paternal sort, wherein infantilized colonized peoples learn to love their parental colonizers. And I already told Trish about this. It may seem that I'm trying to shoehorn Trish's very interesting paper on the media nets into my love framework, and I kind of am. Yet I think love remained a slightly absent presence throughout the public and press attempts to correct bourgeois misapprehensions of media net militancy. After all, this was a group of women with a reputation for many things, including an immorality linked to a type of love that would have been at odds with the monogamous and, I assume, family-building kind celebrated by Auclair and Audouard. Indeed, at least as partial creations of literature, midinets may have counted among the other wives that polygamous French husbands might have sought out. They thus represented a form of loving that had to be concealed or disavowed in order to meet emerging models of proletarian respectability. To that extent, then, I wonder how representative Monette Thomas was among the midinets as a whole, especially since many of her activities seem to consist of impression management and the persuasion of the rank and file to comport themselves appropriately. Here, too, we seem to be in the presence of what seems to be kind of like a bourgeois morality that was obviously ubiquitous at the time. Research on the labor movement suggests attempts by union leaders in France, I think, and in other countries as well, to manage the public image, but also the private lives of male workers during this time, by encouraging them to adopt what might have been seen as the trappings of bourgeois respectability. This included the creation of lending libraries, the Université Populaire in France, and the discouragement of drinking, gambling, and the frequenting of brothels. There may not be sources to answer this question, but was Thomas giving the midinets lessons in respectability for the short-term purposes of political action, or was she also seeking to alter behavior in more fundamental ways? More central to Trish's paper is how the press and male militants struggle to reconcile their impressions of the midinets with their actual behavior, which often seem to frustrate or undermine stereotypes, maintaining their flightiness and impulsivity. To that end, I found it interesting to note the shift in gendered assumptions about the demands made by the midinets, as noted by people like Maurice Millerat and others. This seems to have vacillated from a stereotypical form of feminine excess, emotionalism, impulsivity, to the suspicion that the demands are being influenced by the agitation of renegade males, who I would assume, insofar as they deviate from the masculine norm of the syndicat, would also be represented as kind of either feminine or bestial, and those kinds of tropes end up being combined very often. These are just a few observations and comments inspired by these three very fascinating papers. I'm very aware that these are nuggets of larger projects that are in process, and I look forward to seeing how these projects come to fruition, and I hope that some of these comments may have been of some use. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. We have some time for a couple questions. Talk with Chris about his comments later. But I'm going to act like Phil Donahue for a little bit since the session is being recorded, and I'll bring the mic around so you can speak into it. So are there any questions from the audience for our panelists?
Way in the back. All right, great papers, really appreciate it. These are more comments than anything, which you may or may not have already thought of. Caroline, first, I thought when you were speaking about Audouard, one of the things that came to mind was Rousseau's Émile and the sense of Republican motherhood that was sort of permeating how everything was seen, and I thought maybe you could comment on that. For Patricia, I've got two comments for you. One, the images, I thought, had a good number of people in there who were undeuil, who were in mourning, and I wonder if that appeared anywhere in your research, or if you were going to work on that, or if it influenced the way they wanted wages shifted or time off. The second thing was, you had one comment where you said the houses where blinds are always closed. And that was one of the criticisms of the women. If they had more time, they would be often there. That's a veiled threat of working in brothels. And I wondered if you were going to expand on that in your research, or if you had already. That's it. Here.
I thought about as sort of, thinking about Republican motherhood, and I'm not sure. How did you think of that? I mean, there's throw it right back to you, because I'm not sure what.
Well, the sense of being the woman is going to be there to support the man, and take care of things, and the man is always going to be falling down at the woman's feet. You know, it's just writing a meal for me.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because this kind of differs than from a lot of her other thought, because she didn't have really the sort of sense of Republican motherhood. I mean, she's sort of looking at this as her talking about love it's something that she puts it in these in several times in these contexts of a way of comparing what real love would be in the West, and yet her critique of marriage in the West is brutal. It's totally brutal, and her critique of men is totally brutal. And so it's kind of like it's perhaps a little hypocritical because I think she's using this as a tool. And so it's really interesting that you said that because I'm so immersed in her everything she says, it's kind of like, oh, wait a minute. So thank you. That's a really interesting way of thinking about the way she specifically has this kind of rhetoric of love.
It may just be that the Frenchness has permeated how she sees things, and she doesn't know.
Thank you.
So these are great thoughts. So the images of women en deuil, I haven't seen a lot of invoking of working women in this moment as war widows, but I imagine that there is some of it that comes through, but they're not talking about it a ton in these speeches. They're not invoking that as part of it. They do talk about the sacrifices of the war years in a more vague way, but I want to look back and now have that. Yeah. I think you're right, and that's really interesting. So I need to go back and see what kind of languages. I'm not thinking of any moments where that actually comes through explicitly, but I imagine it's there. I wasn't looking for it, so that's really helpful, thank you. And yes, definitely a reference to a brothel, and I think it's just very much part and parcel of the standard image of these women in this period. They're constantly in pop fiction being talked about as, 2 steps away from prostitution. So in a way, better to be seduced by a bourgeois man on the street who will then keep them. But the response in the hall was one of total indignation, right? That this is an image, they all know what this means, they all know what's being implied and are quite exasperated and indignant about it, yeah.
Your papers were lovely. Is this turned on?
It's turned on.
Okay, fine.
Speak into the mic.
I was really excited about all of them. I'm going to just ask one question, though, for Carolyn. This idea, it seems to me that your feminists are deeply invested in issues of race and gender as instrumental to their own Frenchness. What I seemed not to hear is how their racism is also so predicated on their presentation of Frenchness. The way they were talking about race was absolutely sort of steeped in whiteness. And so I'm wondering if your larger project talks about that.
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. It absolutely does. To various degrees and varying ways. Autoire, these feminists fall along this political spectrum, and there I also, in the larger project, talk about Louise Michel, who's a revolutionary anarchist feminist, and basically the more centrist they are, the more racist and actually also more anti-Semitic they are. And so there's the whiteness, compared to each context is, the idea of, Frenchness, of whiteness, it's part of the inattainability of these colonial subjects ever, becoming French. And Audois, she only goes to Algeria. She travels all over the world, but that's the only French colony she goes to. But it is just, very clear when she's making these comparisons that, first of all, there's also an element of class, a huge element of class, because she is an elite woman and she really thinks that when she goes to Turkey, she visits these elite harems. She's like, it's great here. It's really nice. They all have this nice stuff. And then as she travels, she's repulsed in intensely racialized and gendered ways by kind of everyone. It's a very it is completely central to her worldview. And Eau Claire, who has she develops a real feminist imperialism, and so she's less racist. I mean, she's less racist. She's also less anti-Semitic, but also still anti-Semitic. And because she believes that Algerians, she's really focusing on Algeria. She believes that Algerians can ultimately be assimilated and become French. So in some way, she sees, that they can overcome their non-whiteness ish. I mean, really, it's a sort of, I don't what is a relative racism, relative sexism, relative anti-Semitism, and it's the same thing with being, whether they're pro-imperialist or anti-imperialist. There is no clear dichotomy. Michelle's the only self-professed anti-imperialist, but it's not what we would call anti-imperialism. The same kind of thing. And so I find it really interesting to kind of tear apart these kind of categories. Because I mean, even Michelle, who is, I detest the phrase "a person ahead of their time," but so she has a much greater progressivism and awareness to hierarchies of power and injustices. She can't escape them. She can't escape them. So, thanks.
One more question, and then Elinor wants to speak a little bit.
So I have a question for Andrea. I really appreciated what I think is happening there is your bringing to light debates and discussions about marriage, and at a time when it seemed like the Napoleonic Code would have just shut that down. And so I'm interested in any more that you can say at this stage of your research about kind of the frameworks within these discussions and debates about marriage. I know this excellent comment about love and maybe and sensibility, and what is the literature that these people were reading? I mean, is it Delphine? Is it Corinne? Is it something else? Where I'm just kind of asking for more of what you're doing, because I think this is really interesting.
Yes, so that is one of one of the kind of fascinating things that I am finding in the research. So the Civil Code is promulgated in 1804, but a lot of the people who write into VOM are really acting as if it hasn't been, promulgated. And so one of his most famous clients, and he received hundreds of letters and responses to this woman, was a woman who had 2 children outside of marriage in her early 20s. And she had been in a relationship with a man, and due to kind of obscure circumstances, they were no longer together, but he had left her a fortune. She writes in looking for a husband, and again, she's in her early 20s. She wants a husband between the ages of 60 and 80 because it's not for love, right? It's just so that she can give a name to her children. And she also says, I want a ruined nobleman who has had, bad experiences during the French Revolution. And I mean, again, talking about kind of literary influences, yes, people write in as if they are in the novel La Nouvelle Louise, and as if they're sans preux, and that, how could you even think about marrying, a man who is, has one foot in the grave. And so, yes, so there is, there's no kind of condemnation for her in terms of being kind of stigmatized for having these illegitimate children. And again, I think that has to do with her class. She's an orphan, but she's inherited a fortune. So she's going to be giving this person money kind of in return for the name. So yeah, it's there's a lot of things like that people are just your practice seems to be very different than the Civil Code, and so that is something that I am trying to pursue, but just starting to. Thank you.
And our guest of honor.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel. I'm very deeply touched, and I don't want to start crying. So I'm going to go on to comment about the papers, and I thank everybody for coming. I'm so truly honored, and I hope to be continuing to come to conferences in my retirement. But I just want to thank you all for 3 absolutely wonderful papers and the wonderful comment of someone who isn't so involved in French history anymore. I think the points that you brought out about love and about place are very, very important. And I think in the place issue, the places that these different forms of agency came out, I think are a fascinating way of tying the papers together and looking at the context in which women have agency. So with Carolyn, for example, your women traveled, or they either did it through reading or they physically traveled. And that opens up the imagination. I mean, I have many reactions to your paper in terms of what were their own marital statuses, the fact that they are using polygamy really to critique France, and the question about the racist issue. I think few people during that era were seeing imperialism so certainly they saw it in terms of race, but they weren't self-conscious about it. So that is something that I'm sure you're developing, but I'd like to hear what you say about their marital statuses and about the fact that they have remarkable travels for women in a time that travel made them supposedly vulnerable and they weren't supposed to be traveling. And Andrea, your material is absolutely fascinating as a counterpoint to the Napoleonic Code and to the cult of domesticity, which unfolds in the 19th century, supposedly. And I know you were doing work in the later 19th century. And so one of my questions for you, in addition to the fact that Paris is such a context for this, and during and after the Napoleonic Wars, so how much of this can be generalized to France or other cities, and does it continue through the century, or does your research permit you? I mean, is this something that begins in the early 19th century and continues as a kind of counterforce and venue for marriages based on love or love at first sight or whatever, as opposed to arranged marriages? And Trish, I think, too, that this is Paris, the women are on the streets, is a very important context in terms of place, but also the context of World War I, which, I think it's really important to consider the fact that the Maidenette on strike during World War I were a real threat, and that I'm wondering if they were criticized by the press and by male workers because they were, by that time the Union Sacrée was not such a big phenomenon and it was splitting apart, but the war was beginning to come to an end, and I think that, I'm wondering if they were expected to be loyal to the war and what context the war brings to that, and on that basis, how do you compare the strikes, and does the discourse and the image of the strikers change over the years with the different contexts? But here again, the fact that they're on the streets and the importance of place, I think, is really interesting for the development of agency. So thank you for wonderful, wonderful papers and a wonderful comment.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Elinor, for being such an inspiration to all of us. And thank you to our presenters and our commentator for a wonderful panel. And thank you for your questions and attendance today. And thank you, Patricia Turner, for recording this.
And thank you, Cheryl, for organizing this.
Thank you, Cheryl.